My name is Jesse White. I'm the state representative for the 46th District of Pennsylvania, which includes parts of Washington, Beaver, and Allegheny counties. I think my political career in a lot of ways has been defined by Marcellus Shale. I took office in the end of 2006. Leading up through that campaign, I knocked on every door in my district practically, and I didn't hear one word about gas drilling. As soon as we took office and the phones got turned on, shortly thereafter, we started hearing about all this gas drilling activity in some of the different parts of my district. The first Marcellus well in Pennsylvania was in my district in Mount Pleasant Township. So my political career has evolved with Marcellus Shale, and it's just kind of, as time's gone on, it's made it more and more part of what I do, to the point now where it's kind of the only thing that we do.
And just tell us a little about those early days. How did you start learning about the issues? How did you start recognizing it as an issue of political concern?
Well, early on, it was just something we knew was going on and no one really knew much about it. You know, when you hear there's so many things happening in different places and you kind of file it away and think, okay, maybe I'll hear more about that later, maybe I won't. It was more along the lines of, we were getting, hey, there's this company from Texas that's tracking mud on the roads and there's dust coming up on the houses, and can you talk with them? And seemed very minor, kind of superficial. So we would try to work with some of the companies on that. As time went on, the issue evolved dramatically to the point where, moving into 2008, 2009, we started to hear more and more leasing was going on, more and more drilling. We started to see the flaring, and the public really started to want to know more. And that was kind of the education phase, where everybody said, our goal is to educate. So we did that as best we could. I had a public meeting probably in 2009 at a local high school. We had several hundred people there. And it was still a very collaborative approach at that point. It was industry, it was the DEP, it was everybody kind of working together to make everybody educated. At that point, there were a group of people that were very opposed, but everybody was kind of just pushing them aside. And there was a lot of, oh, that person's just, they're just jealous because they don't have a well, or they want this, or they want that. And no one really knew what to think. As time went on, more and more people started asking more and more questions. And I think that once we got to the point where, moving into like 2010, you really started to see a big shift where the government got involved. Beforehand, it was something that was just kind of happening over here, and the government was over here, and there wasn't a whole lot of interaction. In late 2009, there was a Pennsylvania Supreme Court case, Huntley versus Oakmont. And what that said was that local municipalities had the ability to make certain ordinances that, through zoning, that would dictate certain aspects of the drilling process. So now, for the first time ever, you had government being kind of directly brought into this. So I was a former township supervisor before I was elected as a state rep. So I had some experience in local government, and we always had good relationships with our municipalities anyway. So what I did was I started bringing municipalities together to say, okay, let's figure out some ordinances. How can we make this work? Pool our resources, and we worked with industry to do that in a collaborative way. One of the things that became very interesting when we did that, and it was right around the time I started to realize something was a little bit off, was that we would have in one township an ordinance that would say one thing, and the drilling company would be able to operate there with no problem. And the next township over, they would have virtually the same exact ordinance, but it would somehow be unworkable to the same company. So there was a lot of inconsistencies that were happening there, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So we really started to kind of get into all this, and I think that's where we started to really see a lot of the pressure tactics. And to me, the breaking point, it all kind of came to a head in late 2010 in Mount Pleasant Township, which is where the first well was drilled and where there was really kind of the center of the activity. They were pressuring the township to adopt the industry-written ordinance. They were basically saying, here, we're going to write this, you're just going to pass it and don't ask any questions. And what started to happen was the township said, wait a minute, hold on, let's take a look at this. And what the company did was started basically getting everybody all fired up. They had a big public meeting where they brought in like 500-600 people worked in the industry that were brought in specifically to pack the room, that didn't necessarily live there. What the message then became was, we want to drill and we would love to give you leaseholders all the money we promised you, but that evil township won't let us. And at the time, there wasn't even any ordinance in place. It was totally a false argument. So things got rapidly out of control. What I did was worked with the township, and we suggested a mediator come in. We got a retired federal judge to do a mediation between the drilling company and the township, just to define the issues. Because it struck me as odd that for a company that had all these lawyers, and they would say, well, you're violating the Oil and Gas Act. And the township would say, well, how? And they would say, well, don't worry about it, you just are. And as a lawyer myself, I'm thinking, wait a minute, if you have someone who's in clear violation of the law, usually it helps if you can cite the specific provisions, and they couldn't do that. And that's where things really started to kind of veer off. Another way that they brought pressure to bear on the town was that they organized an industry-wide boycott of the local businesses. And it's not like there were that many local businesses in the town. There was a gas station, a sandwich shop, a few little things, but they had been doing well as a result of all the activity. All of a sudden, anybody that worked in the industry stopped patronizing those businesses. We called the companies out on it. They flew an executive in from Colorado. Mark West they're the midstream company for Range Resources. They admitted to it. It was Mark West and Range were behind it. They acknowledged it probably wasn't the smartest thing in the world, and they pulled off of that tactic. But at that point, it became clear that they were going to pursue some things that probably made it difficult to have a very collaborative relationship going forward. We had to keep our guard up.
This example of the pressure tactics and what breaks down a collaborative relationship is really important for us to hear about, because it's important for other regions. Are there other examples of this sort of the way this is played out? Yeah, I mean, it kind of all went from there. So what happened was, we started to see these divide and conquer tactics, and that was really what it was. And we saw communities really being divided. And I decided at that point, you know what, we're not going to let this happen everywhere. We were learning from our experiences. So what I did was I formed a co-op in early 2011, which was it was loosely modeled after the Marcellus Shale Coalition on purpose. And it was designed to be for municipal governments, of which I have 22 in my district. I think we had 18 that participated. And the whole goal was to get everybody together and use guiding principles that were very similar to the Marcellus Shale Coalition, but to put them in a local government context, to provide that uniformity and consistency, to establish best practices. We were very clear that group was not to advance any sort of a pro or anti-drilling agenda. It was more along the lines of, we are all facing the same challenges. How can we address them collaboratively? Some of the ideas that were brought out from those meetings were very, very strongly opposed by industry. One of which was we'd gotten an idea from, actually in Texas, of having a natural gas enforcement officer, which was someone that would go around and enforce local ordinances that had special training in knowing what to look for. And that was something that was very quickly attacked by the industry, and being, more bureaucracy and wasted taxpayer dollars and all these different things being said to try to convince people it was a bad idea. We started to see a lot more of the propaganda at that point. You saw the Marcellus Shale Coalition became very kind of political. You saw groups like Energy in Depth get involved. So there was a clear opposition building, and it was frustrating to me because we were just doing exactly what they said they wanted, which was, you wanted uniformity, you wanted consistency, you wanted to work together. And what I realized was they didn't want that really, because everybody getting in a room talking to one another made it clear the unbelievable disparity that was actually taking place. And that was the way to beat the divide and conquer mentality. And it was interesting because a lot of the people involved in that co-op were leaseholders, and they were very pro-drilling. So this was not an anti-drilling group. It was never that. It was just the things that we keep saying we want, which is accountability, responsibility, transparency. And industry very quickly did everything they could to try to discredit that group, because they realized that would be a unified voice that would kind of expose some of the things they were trying to do. Can you give me an example of a discrediting tactic or the propaganda that you saw around it? A lot of it was the media. I mean, I think one of the things that people don't realize is that the
around here, the natural gas industry is very influential with the media for a multitude of reasons. Mainly, I think a lot of it has to do with money. Everybody in the business community, in the media, and a lot of these different places, there's this thought of, hey, these are the guys with all the money, and I do business here, so I want to do business with them. So even if I'm not doing business with them now, I might at some point. Therefore, sure, I'm in. For example, one of the most fascinating things I saw in relation to the media was the Golden Quill Awards, or media awards that are given out in the western part of Pennsylvania. Print, radio, television, web, you name it. For the past 2 years, their prime sponsor has been Range Resources. They've actually allowed them to go in and speak at the dinner. And it's funny because I found it just by looking around on the internet. It's not something that anybody else ever talked about. And I just thought to myself, this is a lot deeper than a lot of people realize. So whenever an article would be done about the co-op or something like that, there would invariably be a quote in there from someone from the industry, which is almost always Matt Pizzarella from Range Resources. Range they are the industry player that's clearly the most active in southwestern Pennsylvania, and they definitely took the lead on doing the policy and the public relations end of things. So they would immediately put out a kind of a snarky, dismissive kind of a comment, and just did everything they could to kind of discredit it. A lot of anonymous internet comments, those sorts of things, and just general. If they had been on the level, it would have been a great opportunity for them to say, yes, absolutely, we'll participate, it's a great thing, and they went out of their way to not do that.
Can you give us an example of how having industry in your communities caused divisions within communities that weren't there previously?
Oh, sure. One of the things that we're seeing more than anything is we have a ton of this land is leased. And that's why I've always said I've never called for a ban or a moratorium on drilling. I won't do that. I think it's here, it's happening, and the key is now is how I can be most effective as an elected official is to define that argument. Everybody says, oh, we're for it, but we want to do it the right way. And that's really what this is. This is the battle for defining who gets to define what doing it the right way looks like. That's what this is all about. So what we have is we have leaseholders that are not getting their property drilled on yet, that are waiting for that money, and they're being told by the company, well, you can't do it because of your local government or because of this or because of that. And we know it's because they're just choosing not to drill right now for financial reasons or whatever other reasons. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of argument about the jobs. And I think over the course of time, originally we were told there are going to be all these jobs. And there's no denying there are people that are working in the industry. That is absolutely happening. But there's also not been the decline in out-of-state license plates. It's not, I don't think it's what we were originally being told. We've asked the industry, well, okay, it's been 7 years since the first well's been drilled here. What do you need in terms of workforce development? How should we be training our people? We've tried having forums with schools and all these different things. We can't really get straight answers as to what exactly it is that makes these workers coming in from all these other places so qualified and workers around here so not qualified. It's interesting. There's all these kind of urban myths that are out there, but no one will actually go on record and say, and it's stuff like, well, no one around here could pass a drug test. Or people in southwestern Pennsylvania are just lazy. And that's what's said from people in and around the industry, but no one from industry will go on record and actually say it. So, there's a lot of those kind of things where people, and as time goes on and more people are looking around saying, hey, wait a minute, why are there still all these Texas license plates at the local restaurant? More and more people are catching on to.
Are you able to see that some communities have been affected in a negative way more than others? And I ask because was there something about the character of a community that made them more vulnerable to being taken advantage of by the industry?
I think there were a couple that were definitely, mainly because they were first. Mount Pleasant Township is a perfect example. they were first. So there are by far more wells there than anywhere else in my district. Now, as they're moving in from the very rural areas into some of the less rural areas, where there may be bigger budgets and more staff and more people, and there's just a general higher level of awareness. There's a lot more questions being asked now than there were 5, 6, 7 years ago. But some of those communities, have basically been drilled all the way through. And the thing is, those are the people that sign leases at $30, $40 an acre, not $5,000 an acre. So they were first in every way, shape, and form, and it's not necessarily a good thing. Where there may have been one well being drilled per site as compared to now where they can do 12. So they didn't get the, everybody says, oh, well, you're receiving a royalty check. It's not anything close to what it is, what people would think it is. And meanwhile, these people have real impacts that they have to deal with that are basically being ignored.
Can you tell us a little about that story? And we've heard it elsewhere about in the early days, really pennies. A lot less was offered than now. And so when it's promised that it's an economic boom, one, what does that really look like? Do you consider it an economic boom? And how is it differentiated amongst your communities?
Well, there's actually been some studies done on that where they've shown that basically the highest percentage of the royalties have gone to a very small percentage of property owners. And the thing is, that's just how it is. And that part of it, I'm not going to say, well, the money has to all be divided out equally or whatever. That's not how the free market works, and that's not our place to be able to go in there and judge that. But what we're seeing is it was interesting. It definitely kind of reached a peak in 2008, right before the economy kind of bottomed out. What we saw was there were a lot of kind of middlemen coming in. And what they were trying to do was go in and buy up different properties and put units together that they would then sell to the companies. Because it was easier for the company to negotiate with one landman as compared to negotiating with a bunch of different ones. So that's where you saw this crazy elevation in leasing values. And then all of a sudden, the economy bottomed out, credit froze up, and that all went away almost overnight. So you saw a lot of these property companies all just show up and then disappear because they couldn't function. So what was left was just the companies themselves mainly doing direct leasing with all the leaseholders. So you saw this huge kind of build up and then crash out, and things have kind of leveled out now in terms of the leasing.
Can you, if you kind of ran the laundry list of negatives and also positives that have come with this, and include in there the kind of testimony you're getting from your community about health effects, property values, and other more subtle things that aren't.
It's difficult to be able to give a kind of a laundry list of the impacts, because the problem that we have is we're writing the history of this right now, every single day. We know every day we know more than we did the day before. We know more now than we did 5 years ago. 5 years from now, I'm sure we'll know a heck of a lot more. So it's very difficult to be able to say, well, these are the impacts. I've definitely, a lot of the stuff that's coming out now is definitely a cause for concern. Things about property values. A lot of people saying, I can't get mortgages on my house. I can't do a refinancing. And of course, every time that comes out, the industry is very quick to say, oh, no, that's not true. That's crazy. And I think it kind of goes to one of the fundamental problems that I've seen with the industry, which is, especially certain companies, is, the next time they admit to making a mistake will be the first time. There's just almost no accountability in what they say. And no one could have the track record that you would think they have if you listen to just them talk. I think that people around here would be a lot more willing to believe what they're saying if they would just take some accountability every now and again. I think we get it. This is an industrial process. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have accidents. When that happens, be honest about it. Say, hey, we screwed up. We're going to fix it. We're going to make it right. We're going to learn from it. And we're going to move on. And I think that most people around here are saying that's not happening. So in terms of the effects that people are seeing, the health stuff, it's a concern, because there are a lot of people that are saying, yes, we are having health effects. We don't know. We can't say they're definitely from this, but no one can say that they're not. And it's very tough, because the second someone makes a claim or asks a question, they attack the messenger, and they immediately just go into attack mode. It's all they know how to do, is attack, attack, attack. and then turn around and say, but we want to have a fact-based debate. No, they don't. They just don't.
So we've heard a lot about the potential health effects of routine operations. Mm-hmm. You just mentioned the little problem. They also make mistakes and have accidents. Have there been unplanned problems of the sort you just mentioned, that just some examples you could give us? What kinds of things go wrong?
I'll give you an example. And this gets into where the concern is, where I think the government on the regulatory side is either through a lack of ability or a lack of willingness doesn't follow up or know about a lot of these things. I had a friend who has a police scanner, and he called me at like 9:30 or 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. And this is last fall. There was a Pittsburgh Steelers game going on, so everybody was at home watching the game. And he said, hey, something's going on at the Mark West plant over in Chartiers Township, which is in my district. It's about 2 towns over. It's a huge processing plant. Mark West is Range Resources' midstream provider. They process all the gas as it comes out of the ground. And he said, my friend told me that, hey, they're dispatching fire departments over there. I want to check this out. I said, okay. So I jumped in the car and I drove a little bit down the road into a kind of a high point. Ironically, in the business park where all these companies are located. And I went up to this high ground, and I looked over and I could see a few towns over, and I could just see flames just shooting up into the sky. And I've seen flaring. I know what well flaring looks like. This wasn't well flaring. This was something totally different. And I couldn't believe it. And the fire departments were turned away on the scanner, which is a common tactic. And I understand that to some extent, because sometimes there are things that if it requires specialized training for, you don't want the local volunteer firemen going in there. I get that. That makes total sense to me. The thing that surprised me was that nothing was ever said about it. There was no report ever made to the DEP. There was never a notice of violation. What I think there was a little blurb in the local newspaper that referenced it, and that said, oh, it was nothing to worry about. It was just the safety features working as they were designed to do. And I thought, well, okay, if the safety systems kicked in, that means there was an underlying problem. Something happened. No, it didn't. Don't worry about it. So those are the kind of things that those of us that live around here see, that something like that, I don't know what happened there that night. I mean, I've heard people say that that were there, that there were trucks that were melted, that there were all sorts of stuff going on because of the heat. The point is this: if it wasn't a big deal, why not just say what happened? Explain it to us. We're not stupid. And I think that there's a perception among the public where I think a lot of the public gets very indignant because, you know what, we're not rubes, we're not stupid. Don't treat us like we are. We're grown-ups. This is coal country. We understand in industry. We get how it works. People like my great-grandfather, had black lung from going down in the mines. That's a legacy we live with around here. People understand it. I think that it's very short-sighted to act as though there's no downside to any of this.
Tell me what role DEP and your health authorities and what your governing capacity at the state level and all the way down has been to deal with this.
That I think really that's been the biggest frustration, is that the DEP has made it very clear they are it. They want to be the only ones in the room. They're telling everybody they're the only ones qualified to handle these issues. Secretary Crancer is very vocal, telling the EPA where to go. And by doing what they did with Act 13, which was the omnibus law that they passed and has been partially overturned now thanks to these communities, they kept the local governments out. So what they did was they made it clear the state DEP is the only ones that can be qualified or competent to handle this. And because they're the only ones there, it's very difficult to get a feel for what they're actually doing or not doing. And the problem is this whole thing, I think, as it was sold to the public, was built on this kind of bedrock principle of, okay, we get that this is a little something new and it might be a little risky, but don't worry, there's a grown-up in the room. The DEP's not going to let anything really bad happen. And the thing that's really over the past few months has become very upsetting and almost terrifying is we're learning not only is the DEP not fulfilling their mission, but it also looks, on the surface at least, as though they're actually doing everything they can to help the industry succeed and doing very little to convey to the public any information about what's going on or do their due diligence to investigate problems.
Can you be specific about, it sounds like through law, local governments were cut out of having any kind of authority or oversight?
Right. What happened was this on the state level, this started to get bigger and bigger and bigger to the point where, when everybody knows about that Marcellus shale, but most people only know what they know because of what industry has told them through the extensive PR campaigns and all the money that was spent. Very few people have actually been out here to see what it really looks like for any length of time. So as we were getting these local governments together and they were kind of working together, clearly the industry policymakers thought this was a huge threat. So in 2011, when the legislature passed what is now known as Act 13, one of the things that they kind of slipped in there was a provision that superseded all state or all local ordinances. So it basically said that there will be a basic level of protections in terms of setbacks and things like that, but local governments have no business and are banned by law from doing anything that would strengthen any of those protections. And what it really would have allowed for was, because the setbacks were so minimal, it said that the drilling is permitted in all zoning districts everywhere, and there were very minimal setbacks in place. Which means that someone could go in, and I think this is the thing that most people that live in kind of affluent communities nearby and think, oh, well, I'm glad that's what happened to us. Here's what they don't realize is, under this law, a drilling company could come in, quietly buy up 3 or 4 houses together in a community, sign a lease with the developer who retained the mineral rights, and they could put drilling sites right in the middle of a residential neighborhood. They could absolutely do that. There's nothing to stop anybody. But the industry did a very good job of selling this as, well, we're strengthening protections in so many places because there were none there previously. Totally a false argument, because the communities that actually were working with this, and none of them, by the way, had banned drilling. And that was a difficult argument for them to make, was that these communities, because we'd all been working together and had taken this kind of responsible path, said we are going to just try to minimize the impacts and be fair about it. And that just didn't fit in with the way they were trying to approach things. So there's all these articles about these anti-drilling communities. In some ways, these are some of the most pro-drilling communities in Pennsylvania. They're just not willing to just hand the keys over to the industry and let them do whatever they want.
Can you tell us the cornerstone?
Sure, absolutely. Earlier this year, I was in Harrisburg, and I had gotten a notice of a meeting with a gentleman from Cornerstone Care. Cornerstone Care is a nonprofit health clinic located in my district, maybe a stone's throw from the border of Mount Pleasant Township, where there's a huge concentrated drilling area. We had met with the owner, or the gentleman who runs it. It's a nonprofit, and he was telling us about how there had been people had been getting sick there. And it was the meeting was him, myself, someone from the DEP, and Tim Soliby, our state senator. And the story was that there had been 2 instances where there had been evacuations because the employees were getting sick, that there were problems with there was kind of a metallic taste that people were getting on their mouths on windy days. And they couldn't figure out what was happening. Every time that it happened, they'd call it in the fire department, hazmat. They couldn't find anything. So we had the meeting, and it was really kind of disheartening to watch the DEP and my senator, who's very well connected with the industry, go out of their way to find any excuse it could possibly be other than drilling. Finally, I just asked, because I honestly didn't know. I said, is there drilling activity going on nearby? And the guy from the health clinic just kind of said, yeah, there is. And he said that he had contacted the DEP. The DEP had referred them to the oil and gas unit. The oil and gas unit didn't get back to him for 2 weeks. He said he called Range Resources, who's the drilling company nearby. Range never got back to him. Although Range had no problem going in the media and saying that they were doing everything they can to try to help. They offered no help at all. So that meeting was on a Tuesday or Wednesday. And he warned us, he said, if we don't get this figured out, I don't know what's going to happen. And that Friday morning I was back here, I got a phone call and he said, it happened again and we've got to close. And they didn't know what to do. So we were trying to find a temporary place to put them. They had moved all over the place. They were kind of nomadic for a while, and it was really impacting them. So we got the DEP to go out and do air quality testing. And they didn't tell us when they were going to do it. We actually literally caught them there doing it. And they said, okay, well, we're going to do these tests and we'll give you our findings. And they released a report, it was just a kind of a synopsis. And it said that there were elevated levels of certain things in the air, and it didn't really answer a lot of questions. But it was quickly sent out to the media, and everything's fine, and everybody, there was this kind of assumption, oh, it must be something in the building, or they said in the report that it must have been, there were propane tanks on the property, and one of the things detected was propane, therefore it must be from that. And I emailed the guy from the DEP and said, I need your justification for that, because if the propane tanks were leaking, that would be pretty easy to figure out. And they said, oh, sure, we'll get you that justification before we release it to the media. And then they just released it to the media. The next thing you know, the local news station was out there with Matt Pizzarella from Range on their property doing a story trying to say it was from paint cans that were outside. Energy in Depth grabbed onto it, and all of a sudden I was the state rep who cried wolf, and I was this fear monger and everything. And I was very careful at that point to say, I am not saying this is related to drilling. That was not what I was trying to say. My point was, I said to the DEP, we need you to release your quality assurance, quality control data so we can see for sure what's really going on here, because there were other scientists and people that had an interest in this, and they said, look, we'll take a look at everything for you, and we just want to solve the problem. We're not trying to blame anybody. We just want to figure it out. The DEP emailed me and said, we have 400 and some pages of data. It's on its way to your office. You'll have it within an hour. 3 hours later, I got another email from the same person at DEP that said, on second thought, we will not be releasing that to you. We need to do further analysis. So I said, are you telling me that your analysis was wrong? And he said, oh, no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we need to do more analysis. So there was a second analysis that came out that showed more components in the air of things that would be problematic. And nothing else was ever said. So I did a right to know request for the QA/QC data to see it, and that request was denied. They said it was part of a non-criminal investigation, therefore they didn't have to release it, and they never have. But what happened was they were actually drilling a well right at that time, right nearby, and at this point, that's when everything kind of really clicked to me and said, uh-oh, this is scary, because if there's nothing going on here, why in the world would the DEP not release that data? And if that's the position they're taking and the way they're approaching this, oh my God, what else are they not telling us? And that's when I really started to realize that not only is there not a grown-up in the room, but they're actually bending over backwards to help the industry not disclose any problems that may actually be existing. And that's kind of a terrifying thought.
Probably needs to be our last question. So
Sure.
think about if there's, while you're talking, if there's anything else you want to say. But where's your Department of Health at all scales and all this?
A lot of this everything's been kind of shunted through to the DEP. I mean, that's just the way it's been. I know in the Cornerstone instance, the Department of Health was, they were kind of tied into it, but they were the DEP basically, they're the guys that show up and say, we're in charge, nobody ask any questions. And what it all boils down to, as we've said all along, is we need to be looking at what are our best practices here. I think one of the issues with Cornerstone was the open water impoundments that happened. There are these big, huge frack ponds all over the place that are just kind of open. And that's something that a lot of people have had a lot of concerns about. And as we looked at other states and even other operators within Pennsylvania, most other companies don't do that as a best practice. They're like, there's no way we would do that. They would use a closed loop, closed containment system, which would mean that there'd be no way that there'd be any leaking into the groundwater. So that's where I think whenever people like me are being branded as anti-drilling, that's absolutely not true. If you want to come in and have an honest conversation with me about what your practices are, why you choose to do them that way, I actually have pretty good relationships with a lot of the drilling companies, but unfortunately it's Range and kind of the ones that around here have been the big ones, have made it really difficult because they just won't answer the most basic questions about what they do or why they do it.
Do you see that as a key to your future work on this, is just developing a portfolio of best practices by looking around and that being your advocacy?
That's a big part of it, is going forward is, one of the things we've always tried to do is be very fact-based in what we do. I don't say things unless I know them to be true. I try to shy away from sensationalism. I think the part of the problem is we're finding more and more out, people don't want to believe it's true, but I think a lot of times they know that there's some things that don't add up. So that's kind of been the struggle that we've dealt with. But yeah, I think, and that's the way to say to people, look, don't just assume that frack pond is a best practice because the company that's doing it says it is. Let's get some real discussion going about that. And I think as time goes on, you're going to see more and more of that kind of stuff come out. And, because I think that at the end of the day, if I could use one word to describe how they've approached these companies that are kind of really pushing this, it's short-sighted. If we really want to see jobs and we really want to see a kind of a 21st century economy built around energy around here, which most people say they want to see, we got to do it the right way. And if we come in and it's smash and grab and it's just so you can come in and get it quick and get out, we're going to be left holding the bag and they're going to move on to somewhere else. And so we can't allow them to be short-sighted in the way they approach it, because if so, the impacts, the positive impacts are going to be short-lived, but the negative impacts are going to be very long-term.
Great. Do you have anything else?
That was an awesome way to end, but just in one way, like you hit this wall, hit this wall getting information to help the people that you represent.
Right.
People that you represent on a daily basis are approached by these people. What kind of guidance, how do you maintain hope in terms of like representing the people that live in this community and providing them with the information they need?
Well, one of the things I think that really has been encouraging to me is the fact that the people themselves, a lot of whom work in the industry, they will come to me quietly and say, do not stop what you're doing. They tell me things, they point me in certain directions, they tell me what's happening, and that's helpful. Knowing that really there's not a whole lot of other people around here that are really in my position that are speaking up, which has made me a very easy target. I've been hit left and right with character attacks from Range and some of these people, knowing that, this is one of those things. It's kind of bigger than me. It's bigger than an election. I live here. I grew up here. I'm going to raise a family here. And if one day when this all comes out and everybody talks about how it all happened, if I don't know how I could look my kids in the eyes and tell them I just just stuck my head in the sand and didn't do anything. I mean, all I'm doing is asking questions that I think are very reasonable questions. I'm not trying to manipulate the answers, but I think the fact that no one will answer these simple questions in a lot of ways tells us all we need to know. I think that in terms of how the federal policy impacts the state policy, I think it's kind of a microcosm of how what's happening in local communities is impacting state policy. If it's not in your backyard, you're not paying attention to it, you're not caring about it the same way. And given that, I find it hard to believe how there's going to be enough of a groundswell at the national level to be able to want to go back and reevaluate those things. Maybe as time goes on and we learn more and it becomes clear that something has to be done, maybe so, but I think at this point, one of the big things in the first, especially early on, was kind of figuring out who's responsible for what here. And I've really kind of stayed focused on what we can be responsible for at the state and at the local level, and realizing that the national level is a whole other sphere that at this point I just don't see a lot of potential for movement. So we've got to do what we can here, and I got to worry about the people that live in my district, and hopefully as time goes on, more and more people catch on.
As a local level politician, you see problems with the way your state's handling this. Do you see avenues for you to work on federal level policy?
I think the best thing we can do to impact policy as a whole is to keep doing what I'm doing, which is basically asking the questions, getting the answers. And if, and again, if they're doing everything the way they say they are, you would think that they would be quick to say, here it is. You want to see our 400 pages of data to show we did it the right way? Knock yourself out. But by taking these instances and highlighting them and keeping to ask the questions, I think that's what elevates the issue, raises the awareness, and hopefully that'll be the thing that makes more people pay attention.